In the last part of our PortalKeeper tutorial, we'll get deeper into the subject. Your own concern might be slightly different than those presented, and you would be interested in cloning and customizing one of the default agents. For instance, one of the ONYACTEC vendor modules leverages the native DNN Captcha control, yet it renders the display within its own control hierarchy. Adapting that Captcha should not be much different from our current situation. Eventually, you should be able to start over from scratch with an agent of your own, which is what we'll be doing now. Note that this is mainly intended for a public of integrators, especially since this is a pretty low-level agent. However, DNN power users should be able to copy, paste, and mingle with the many simple agent parts, a bit like Lego blocks, and to build their own custom agents without extensive development knowledge. The XML export-import feature should also ease the sharing of those blocks, and we will provide a public repository for contributions during that release cycle. Let's disable the original adapter. And let's make sure that the native behavior is restored. And let's start over with creating a new adapter. Our journey will have 3 moments: the setup and a phase of analysis, trying to figure out a detailed plan. Then, building the display logic to render the proper HTML. And finally, building the validation logic to hook Recaptcha's validation logic into the native logic. We have to enter a name, and we should enter a description. There are 2 adapted control modes: type, which accepts a qualified .NET type, and path, which accepts user control path. The other example, which adapts the Event Viewer module's main form, illustrates those adapters with form-level manipulation. Now let's restate our problem. We need to learn how Recaptcha works, and we need to find hooks in the native DNN Captcha to replace the display and validation logic with Recaptcha's equivalent. Let's start with Recaptcha's documentation. There is a page for displaying and a page for validation. The page for displaying gives us HTML and JavaScript templates, which rely on the public key. It also tells us the name of the challenge and answer posted form fields so that we can retrieve them later back on the server and pass them to the validation logic. Validation is about sending an HTTP request to Google's API servers, and it relies on the private key. Now let's move on with DNN Captcha. One useful tool to have around is a disassembler. By dropping the main.netnuke.dll assembly file from the bin folder, I can browse the main hierarchy of types. Let's search Captcha. We find our Captcha control. The Captcha handler is responsible for drawing the actual Captcha image itself. So now I know the type I want to adapt. Our type is available in the list of common types. but you can manually browse the loaded application domain for any available assembly. Or enter a string manually. Let's validate our selection. Now let's figure out the hooks. There are two adapter modes, type and dynamic adapter. Type will let you register a regular .NET adapter control type. Dynamic adapters will let you hook online agents to the overrides and event handlers. This is what we want here. Okay, back to the disassembler. We can figure out that the HTML is generated dynamically in the render method. Here's a div, here's an image, another div, and a text input. Let's match that on the client side. So here's our div, our image, the other div, the text input. We want to display the Recaptcha content here. As for the original div, we would rather remove it, but that would probably break the DNN server component, which certainly relies on the posted fields. So we'll just hide it. Back to our render method. The HTML writer argument is sequentially passed the attributes and tag names for the client HTML. If we run our agent beforehand, we can start inserting Recaptcha's HTML content and then pass a style attribute to the writer before the native render to hide the main div of the native Captcha. That makes two actions and a solid plan for our display agent. Let's now talk validation. We've got a validate method and a user validated event. This should be ideal, and we wouldn't need to figure out the state and lifecycle. The ASP.NET Server Validate event args should be a good hook. However, unfortunately, DNN fails to account for any processing of that argument, so we're good for the harder way instead. Here's the plan. We'll still hook to the event, run Recaptcha validation request, and then we'll call the native validate method again, with the correct Captcha response if Recaptcha is valid, and with an empty string if Recaptcha is invalid. There are two consequences with that. First, since the method fires the event itself, we need to prevent an infinite loop between method calls and event firing. So we'll signal our first call, but that is an artifact that we can postpone to the end. And then we need to get hold of the correct answer. With an analysis of the getNextCaptcha method, we can find out that the correct answer is stored in the Captcha text field. And with an analysis of the field itself, we can confirm it is passed to the client in the page view state and recovered with the posted data before the validation occurs. So we'll need to figure out an access to that field. Let's just assume that we'll make it. So this is it. We've got two identified hooks and a complete plan. Let's get started.